My question is, given your findings, how do you propose that we change the narrative about poverty in the U.S., which is currently hinged all about personal responsibility? How do we go about changing that narrative in light of these findings?
Eldar talked about, I think the example Eldar gave is just so terrific about the cockpit. So let me expand on a little story he touched on lightly. So in World War II, I know it sounds like we have some sort of World War II fetish. We're not British. We don't have any sort of. But in World War II, there was a problem. There was these. Was it the B-17s? The B-17s were landing, and there was a certain type of crash that was happening at an alarming frequency. And that crash was, as the plane would land and hit the ground, the pilots would retract the landing gear, which is not a good thing when you're landing. And if you see your pilot doing it, I mean, forget it, you're done. And so what they wanted to know was, they wanted to know what was going on inside these pilots' minds. So they brought in a psychologist, Lieutenant Chapanis, who was a trained psychologist. And Chapanis did a lot of surveys trying to understand, why are these people not being good pilots? Why are they not being personally responsible? I mean, it's pretty stupid. Did we not train them enough? Did we not pick the right people? After all, it is a war and you're bringing in a lot of new people, maybe you made a mistake. And Chapanis did something that I still find just personally admirable. It's amazing. The most amazing thing a person can do is when they're looking at a problem through one lens, the one lens they've been so trained to do, is to shift and see it totally differently. At some point he said, I'm not going to look in these guys' heads anymore. I'm going to look inside the cockpit. And he looked at the cockpit and he said, oh, here's the lever for retracting the landing gear. Here's the lever for the flaps, which you ought to be putting down to slow yourself down. And look at these levers. They look pretty similar. And look, they're right next to each other. That's the problem. Forget the head of the pilot. We should redesign the cockpit. And that revolutionized cockpit design. It went from a view that we have to train pilots, that we have to get them to be excellent, to a view that says, we'll do that, but whatever we do, mistakes will happen. And they'll happen at a high enough rate that what we ought to do is to redesign the cockpit so that mistakes are minimized, so that when they do happen, there isn't a huge consequence. And in fact, if you look at the decline, and there's been an amazing decline in air traffic fatalities, in airplane crashes and fatalities of crashes, almost all of that, people are stunned to learn in the last 60 years, is due not to technology, better aircraft, not to better training, but entirely to cockpit design. That's the only reason we have safer flights today than 60 years ago. Why am I telling you this story? Because I think the same thing ought to happen with poverty policy in the next 60 years, which is whatever a person does, and this happens in your own life, forget the poor, think in your own life, despite your best intentions, you will yell at your kids when you know you ought not to. That's just a mistake that happens. It's not a lack of personal responsibility. It's just, it happens because you were overloaded and mistakes happen. Now, when you yell at your kid, you have a remedy. You can make it up to them and you can deal with it. That's a circumstance where the errors are, you are able to, if you designed it well, minimize the consequences. In policy, we often don't do a good job of setting it so that things are fault tolerant, so that small mistakes are washed out. For example, hypothetically, suppose some government were to decide we ought to have a binding lifetime term limit on the amount of welfare payments you could receive. And I'm just saying, suppose some government were to decide that. And what we were further supposed to do is to say, well, we'll make it a lifetime 5-year limit. Now think of the errors that happen. You have a long time to work on a project, you don't think about it, you let it slip. You have 5 years of welfare, you don't think about how little you have left, and before you know it, you only have 6 months left. And we make matters worse by not flashing with big lights, you only have 4 years left, you only have 80% left, et cetera, et cetera. That's an example of a very fault-intolerant policy. And if you just look around our poverty policy, there's a lot of fault intolerance. That's not about personal responsibility. I think this is actually a middle ground. It says you have to encourage personal responsibility no matter what. At the same time, you have to have a thing that says, conditional on having the best personal responsibility, whatever, there are going to be mistakes, and what are you doing about natural, honest mistakes? And I think that's probably the most useful poverty policy.